Picture a quiet lake in southern Louisiana, held between forests and swamp. Its surface lies calm, almost like glass. Clouds drift across it twice, once in the sky and once below. Along the shore, you hear leaves rustle and ducks call. Nothing there suggests danger. Nothing hints at a hidden abyss. Local people had a name for that stillness. They called it the Mirror of Peigneur. You could look down and see yourself clearly, as if nature were playing with you through a mirror. It seemed shallow, gentle, and familiar. Then, on the 20th of November, 1980, Lake Peigneur disappeared. It did not dry out, it did not spill over a broken dam, it did not shrink season by season. It collapsed underground. Within hours, a quiet freshwater lake became a deep saltwater basin. A calm surface became a wound in the earth. That morning, people felt the ground shake beneath their feet. A low, muffled roar followed. Fishermen later called it the breathing of the earth. At first, nobody understood what was happening. It seemed as if the planet had opened its mouth to swallow everything alive. The disaster at Peigneur has been described as one of the most mysterious geological catastrophes of Europe, even though the place itself lies in Louisiana. That strange mismatch almost fits the story. This was a catastrophe born from mismatched maps, hidden geology, and a tiny error in position. One wrong coordinate awakened forces millions of years old. Southern Louisiana is a whole world of water. Rivers, swamps, and narrow waterways divide the land into shifting passages. The Mississippi River winds thousands of times before reaching the Gulf of Mexico. It creates a maze where even familiar ground feels uncertain. In a landscape flat as a table, geologists noticed something unusual. 5 hills rose from that flatness. They stood like islands cutting into the plain. Local French Cajuns had long treated those places with caution. In their legends, the hills breathed, grew, and moved. Educated people dismiss those stories as fishermen's superstition, but superstition can be an ancient language. Sometimes it describes complex geology before science gives it names. The Cajuns were not entirely wrong. Those hills were not ordinary hills. Their movement was simply too slow for human eyes. To understand Lake Peigneur, you must go back millions of years. The land now called Louisiana was once a shallow, warm sea. That sea was full of life, yet its greatest geological treasure was salt. Over immense stretches of time, the sea retreated and evaporated. As the water vanished, it left behind salt layers kilometers thick. Later, other materials settled above them. Tons of sand, clay, and silt pressed downward. Salt is lighter than the rock that buries it. Under pressure, it does not behave like hard stone. It flows, not quickly and not dramatically. It moves like toothpaste squeezed inside a tube, or like thick jelly under pressure. Its pace has been compared to the growth of fingernails. But that slow motion is relentless. The rising salt pushed upward. It bent the Earth's crust from below. Geologists call these underground salt bubbles salt domes, or diapirs. The 5 Louisiana hills are the tops of such domes. Avery Island is the most famous among them. Avery Island is known for the famous Tabasco sauce. Jefferson Island is another one of these hills. Beneath Jefferson Island, the catastrophe slept. For a salt dome, a human lifetime is only an instant. What seems eternal to people is merely a passing moment underground. Jefferson Island sounds like a presidential place, yet it was not named for a ruler, a military commander, or an oil millionaire. In 1869, the island was bought by Joseph Jefferson. At that time, Joseph Jefferson's fame eclipsed even the brightest stars of Broadway. He was known as a master of transformation. For decades, he performed one role above all others. That role was Rip Van Winkle. The story follows a man who falls asleep in the mountains and wakes 20 years later. When Rip wakes, the world has changed beyond recognition. His friends have aged. Houses have been rebuilt. Yet Rip himself remains unchanged, as if time has no power over him. Joseph Jefferson performed Rip Van Winkle more than 4,500 times. Night after night, audiences returned to hear the same lines. They saw more than an actor. They saw themselves. They saw the fear of waking to discover that life had moved on without them. Jefferson became the face of a man who slept through change. On Jefferson Island, he built an estate. It was not a palace, it was a cozy house with a veranda. From that veranda, he could look over Louisiana swamp, Mississippi waterways, and sunsets that turned the sky crimson. Time there seemed to stand still. Later, his family created a garden on the island. They called it Rip Van Winkle Gardens. The name felt perfect. The place seemed frozen in time. Ancient oaks stood there, some already 100 years old when Jefferson first set foot on the land. Brick paths were carefully kept. Flower beds held rare orchids brought from Florida. A lily pond shimmered, and carp splashed below the surface. The silence was so deep that a falling leaf could be heard. Above ground, it was a peaceful paradise. But beneath that paradise, another life continued. It knew neither silence nor rest. Under the island, salt behaved like thick toothpaste inside a tube. For millions of years, sand, clay, and silt had pressed down on it. The salt did not break. It flowed. It rose at the speed of a fingernail's growth. It formed huge underground bubbles. These hidden giants had been growing there for millennia. They bent the crust like a sail under wind. Sometimes their tops reached the surface. Jefferson Island stood directly over one such salt dome. From the beginning of the 20th century, salt domes attracted more than geologists. Salt is not only something placed on food, these domes can also point toward deeper wealth. Oil and gas may collect in cavities left by salt extraction. They may also gather in folds around salt domes. Those folds are natural traps created by the planet. They promise riches. They also contain danger. In 1956, Diamond Crystal received the right to mine salt beneath Jefferson Island. The company cut a mine into the salt dome. The mine reached deep underground. Between 300 and 460 meters down, tunnels were carved through salt. They were like entire underground streets. Some chambers stood as tall as an 8-story building. Others were as wide as a city street. Their ceilings were held by massive salt columns. The columns looked white, almost like marble. They seemed strong. That strength was an illusion. Salt dissolves under water pressure. When it dissolves, it loses its ability to hold. Miners sometimes felt tremors in the galleries. They told one another the shaking was just echoes from boats on the lake. Work continued. Every day, 55 people descended into the mine. They carried ordinary hopes into an extraordinary underground world. One miner was a father of 3 children, dreaming of buying a house. Another was a young man saving for a wedding. Another was a veteran who had worked in mines for 30 years. He knew every turn of the tunnels. They put on helmets, took tools, and waved to families at the entrance. Above them, Lake Peigneur looked harmless. Fishing boats rocked on the water. Old Ben, with a gray beard, cast his net. 2 boys tried to catch catfish with a homemade fishing rod. A young couple kissed on the bow of a canoe. None of them knew an entire city of salt lay below. 2 different companies were working in the same hidden space. One company had maps for the miners. Another company had maps for the oil workers. The oil workers began exploration slightly later. Both maps were old, from the 1940s. Their corners were folded, and pencil markings crossed the paper. The problem was not only age. The 2 maps used different coordinate systems. Think of one map measuring distance in meters and another in feet. Or picture one team measuring from an old oak by the road while another measures from a leaning pole near the outskirts. The difference seemed small. It was only fractions of a degree. Engineers from both companies believed there was a safe distance between the objects. They believed there was another 50 meters of reserve. Nothing would happen, they said. No one checked the discrepancy. No one compared and reconciled the maps. Those worn maps became an invisible thread. It stretched between the mine, the lake, and the drilling platform. Soon it would pull tight around the fate of everything nearby. A single error, even 1 centimeter in the wrong place, could awaken the sleeping giant. By 1980, Texaco had won a tender to explore for oil directly under Lake Peigneur. A huge floating drilling platform stood on the calm water. It was a metal mass with a derrick rising into the sky. Engines roared. Smoke drifted above the lake. Below, miners worked in salt galleries hundreds of meters deep. The overlap was not secret. The oil workers knew miners were below. The miners knew drilling was happening above. Both sides had maps of the deposit, both trusted them. Yet those maps belonged to the 1940s, worn, bent, faded, and slightly misaligned. On the early morning of the 20th of November, 1980, the sky was just beginning to brighten. A light haze lay over the water. The air smelled of swamp mud. On the Texaco platform, drillers noticed something wrong. The drill had been biting evenly into rock. Suddenly, it stuck. Then it began rotating incorrectly. It lost rhythm. It trembled as if alive. The platform rocked slightly. The first motion was so faint that one worker merely adjusted his helmet. He gave it no importance. A minute later, the jolt returned, stronger. The whole platform shook. Fastenings creaked. Chains clanged against metal. Then a sound rose from under the water. Witnesses later called it a muffled roar from the Earth's womb. It came from directly beneath their feet. It seemed as if the planet sighed, woke up, and grumbled. The crew did not wait. They abandoned equipment, tools, and unfinished coffee in mugs. They ran toward lifeboats. Men shouted and pushed past one another. Someone slipped on the wet deck. Someone became tangled in cables. Everyone rushed for shore. They escaped in time. At that moment, the Texaco drill had missed its calculated point by 90 centimeters. Less than a meter changed everything. The drill pierced the roof of the salt mine on the 3rd level. The opening was only 35 centimeters wide. It was no larger than a small plate, a pot lid, or a cat flap. That tiny hole was enough. Lake water pressed downward with enormous force. A huge water column above the mine acted like a giant press. The force was described as hundreds of tons. Water is a universal solvent. Salt dissolves very well in it. The first leaders entered the mine and began widening the hole. Water found salt and ate into it. The passage grew wider, pressure increased, more water rushed in. That brought even more dissolution. The cycle accelerated. A chain reaction had begun, and no human hand could stop it. The earth had opened its mouth. Deep below, on the 4th level of the mine, 44 people were working. Water suddenly poured from the ceiling. At first it was a thin stream, then it became a wall of water. The emergency warning system activated. A race with death began. People ran through tunnels that had been ordinary workplaces minutes before. Water rose around their legs. Soon it was knee-deep. The lift to the surface could carry only 8 people. First, 9 workers from the lowest, 3rd level were evacuated. Then the rest came up trip after trip. Every lift ride mattered. Every delay could have sealed the mine. The last group reached the surface only minutes before the huge mass of water collapsed the vaults. The lower horizons flooded forever. All 55 miners survived. That survival remains the only miracle in the story. On the surface, the lake had gone mad. Fishermen saw the center of the lake begin to turn. At first, the rotation was slow. Then it accelerated. A whirlpool formed, 50 meters across. It grew to 100 meters, then it spread to 200 meters. Boards vanished first. Then branches, reeds, and loose debris spun inward. 2 fishermen were caught near the epicenter. Their boat was dragged toward the center of the growing whirlpool. They rowed harder than they ever had in their lives. One managed to tie his boat to a tree in shallow water. The other threw himself onto a shoal. Both survived. Their boats and fishing gear disappeared into the abyss. Before witnesses' eyes, the whirlpool kept growing. The giant drilling platform tilted. It broke apart. In seconds, it sank like a toy. 11 heavy barges were moored at the shore. Thick steel cables held them. The cables snapped as if they were threads. Tugboats tried to hold the barges back. The water took everything. One after another, the barges moved toward the center of the whirlpool. 9 barges disappeared. 2 remaining barges became stuck near the edges. They trembled and creaked as if praying for rescue. Then the shore began to fail. 65 acres of land collapsed into the void. That is 26 hectares sliding away. Part of the famous Rip Van Winkle Botanical Garden vanished. Ancient oaks went down, including trees that had grown for centuries. Paths once walked by the great actor were swallowed. Statues disappeared too. They slid with a roar into boiling water and were gone forever. The process lasted about 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Lake Peigneur lost 13 million cubic meters of water. A lake that had seemed permanent emptied into a mine. Then came another sight, almost beyond belief. A fountain erupted from the mine shaft, the same shaft the miners had used to escape. It rose like a geyser, 120 meters high. The cause was air displaced by water flooding the tunnels. That trapped air finally found an exit. A column of water, stones, and salt dust shot upward. It climbed higher than a 25-story building. It was as if the planet sneezed out what had entered it. By noon the next day, the violence had quieted, but the old Lake Peigneur no longer existed. In its place was a dirty, steaming depression. A hole in the ground, hundreds of meters across, marked the collapse. Engineers and geologists had seen disaster, yet nature still had another response waiting. Lake Peigneur was connected to the Gulf of Mexico by the narrow Del Cambre Canal. Normally, water flowed from the lake through the canal toward the Gulf. After the collapse, the lake had become a giant pit more than 400 meters deep. Its water level fell tens of meters below the level of the Gulf. Nature does not tolerate emptiness. Gulf water rushed into the canal. Del Cambre Canal began flowing backward. Where the canal entered the lake, the height difference was enormous. A waterfall formed. It became the highest waterfall in the history of Louisiana. A 50-meter stream of salt water from the Gulf of Mexico roared into the empty basin. Foam filled the air. The waterfall lasted for several days. It refilled the lake. When the water levels of the lake and the Gulf equalized, the waterfall disappeared. But Lake Peigneur had changed forever. Before the disaster, it was a shallow, freshwater lake. Its average depth was 3 meters. It had been overgrown with water lilies. After the disaster, it became salty. It became dark. It also became the deepest lake in Louisiana. Its maximum depth reached almost 400 meters. Later, 9 of the 11 sunken barges resurfaced. They had been sucked into the mine. When internal and external pressure equalized, they rose like corks. 2 barges remained at depth. They lie near the wreckage of the drilling platform and the pier. The legal aftermath lasted for years. Texaco was recognized as the main culprit. The reason was the coordinate calculation error. Texaco paid the mine owners and the foundation that owned the garden tens of millions of dollars in compensation. The salt mine was destroyed forever. The 55 miners survived, but they lost their jobs. Today, Lake Peigneur attracts visitors. Divers descend into its gloomy depths. They search for the ghosts of sunken machinery. Rip Van Winkle gardens were restored, yet their shoreline is different now. The old edge of the paradise is gone. The irony surrounding Joseph Jefferson is hard to miss. He became famous playing Rip Van Winkle, the man who slept through change. He built his house on an island above a sleeping geological force. He did not see the ground beneath his garden wake. Within a few hours, it changed everything. His oaks and gardens slid into the abyss. That abyss resembled the danger once preserved in legends. The Chitimacha Indians had lived in this region for thousands of years. Their legends treated water as a living being. They warned that land in such places should not be disturbed without need. To modern ears, that may sound like superstition. For the Chitimacha, it was experience. They had watched a capricious landscape shaped by flowing salt geology. Their warning did not use laboratory language, but it understood that this ground was never truly still. Even now, the story is not completely closed. Cavities beneath the lake are used for gas storage. Local residents and geologists notice strange bubbles on the surface. These bubbles may be leaks. Hydrologists say the situation is safe, yet no one can give a 100% guarantee. Perhaps another mystery still sleeps underwater. Perhaps it will remain asleep. But Lake Peigneur has already answered one question with terrifying clarity. The earth beneath us is not dead. It breathes, moves, dissolves, and grows in geological time. Humans walk on a thin crust. Beneath calm water and ancient oak roots, processes formed over millions of years continue their slow work. When human time accidentally meets the Earth's alarm clock, disaster can arrive in hours. At Peigneur, an ordinary lake vanished underground, and the trigger was a drill point only 90 centimeters long, opening a hole just 35 centimeters wide.